On October 13th, 1899, the residents of Selkirk, Montana, awoke to a chilling discovery. 7 beds in the Thornfield household were undisturbed, yet the rooms felt eerily empty. Gabriel Thornfield's 7 daughters, Margaret, 26, Catherine, 24, twins, Eleanor and Elizabeth, 22, Sarah, 20, Grace, 17, and Rebecca, 14, had vanished without a trace, leaving no footprints in the morning frost. Their nightgowns hung perfectly where they had left them, as if they had simply disappeared into the air. The sheriff's report, sealed for nearly 80 years, revealed that every room had been meticulously searched by someone familiar with the house. Strangely, nothing was missing, not jewelry, clothes, or even money. The fate of the Thornfield sisters remains one of America's most perplexing mysteries, tied to a web of greed, corruption, and human trafficking. This dark chapter of history, hidden for over a century, is part of a conspiracy that stretches far beyond Selkirk. Selkirk in 1899 was a town caught between 2 worlds. Once a rough frontier settlement, it had evolved into a bustling community, its prosperity fueled by silver mining. However, beneath the surface, tensions simmered, labor disputes between miners and investors, and mysterious disappearances of young women. At the heart of this transformation was Gabriel Thornfield, a successful merchant who had arrived in Selkirk in 1892 with his 7 daughters after losing his wife to pneumonia. Over time, Gabriel built the largest store between Missoula and Butte and secured exclusive contracts with mining companies. His impressive mansion on Maple Street was a symbol of his success and devotion to his daughters. The Thornfield sisters were admired by the town. Margaret, the eldest, was a progressive schoolteacher known for her dedication. Catherine, an artist, enriched the town's cultural life with her paintings. The twins Eleanor and Elizabeth ran a successful seamstress business. Sarah, a gifted singer, organized religious and charitable events, while Grace, a financial prodigy, helped her father with his business. Rebecca, the youngest, was beloved by the community for her kindness and empathy. Yet Gabriel's rapid rise to wealth aroused suspicion. Whispers about his connections to powerful interests grew especially after he started hosting private meetings with strangers arriving on the evening train. The economic climate of 1899 added to the unease. Strikes were common in nearby mining towns, and the expansion of the Northern Pacific Railroad brought both prosperity and criminal activity to Selkirk. By October 12th, Gabriel's daughters had started behaving unusually. Margaret appeared distracted and disheveled. Catherine struggled to focus on her painting, and the twins seemed unsettled as they worked. It was clear something was wrong, but no one could have predicted the horror that would unfold the next day. That afternoon, the Thornfield sisters' usual cheer was replaced by anxious whispers, stopping abruptly whenever customers entered their shop. Mrs. Dorothy Fleming, who brought in a jacket for alterations, later testified that the twins seemed nervous, making repeated mistakes with measurements. Sarah, normally confident in her singing, struggled during hymn practice at the church, her pitch wavering and repeatedly stopping mid-song. When Reverend Thomas Atwood asked if something was wrong, she claimed to be unwell, but refused help. Grace, working with her father in the store, was quieter than usual and made errors in simple calculations, unlike her typical sharpness. Gabriel Thornfield himself appeared uneasy, often checking his pocket watch and glancing down the street as if expecting something or someone that never arrived. Even Rebecca, usually lively, seemed subdued while helping with chores, asking strange questions about travel and separation from loved ones. By mid-afternoon, the sisters' behavior became even more unsettling. At around 300, Dr. Samuel Porter, returning from a house call, saw all 7 sisters walking together toward the train depot. This was out of the ordinary, as they usually had separate tasks in the afternoon. What struck Dr. Porter most was the unnatural way they walked, silent, pale, and with an expression of deep distress. They moved in a stiff, almost military manner, their usual grace replaced by an eerie determination. Only Rebecca looked back at Dr. Porter, her eyes wide with fear, offering a silent, desperate plea for help. This fleeting moment of connection haunted Dr. Porter long after. The last confirmed sighting of the Thornfield sisters came at 9:15, when Timothy Fletcher, the night clerk at the telegraph office, noticed them standing in a perfect line beneath a street lamp. Their rigid posture and focused gaze were unnerving, as if they were waiting for something or someone. They were dressed in their finest clothes, more suited to a special event than an ordinary evening, adding to the sense of foreboding that hung in the air. The sisters' hair was styled with unnerving formality, and each wore jewelry typically reserved for church services or special events. But what struck Fletcher most was the fear and resignation on their faces. Their expressions suggested they were bracing for an ordeal, not preparing for a celebration. When he looked up again about 10 minutes later, they had vanished without a trace, as silently as they had arrived. The hours that followed remain a mystery, as the only account came from Gabriel Thornfield, whose testimony would later be found inconsistent. According to Gabriel, he retired to his study around 10:00 p.m. to review business correspondence. He claimed to have spent about 90 minutes reading letters and updating his records. Mrs. Caldwell, the housekeeper, left the house at her usual time 10:00 and provided vital details about the house's atmosphere. She described an eerie silence. The usual sounds, the sisters' voices, footsteps, and the house settling were absent. She also noted that the sisters hadn't prepared for the following day, which was unlike their usual routine. Gabriel insisted that he went to bed at 11:30 p.m., believing his daughters had already retired. He followed his usual routine, checking doors and windows, praying in the family chapel, and going to bed alone. But what happened between 11:30 p.m. on October 12th and dawn on October 13th remains a mystery. Gabriel claimed he slept soundly, but the next morning's discovery contradicted his account. When Mrs. Caldwell arrived at the house at dawn on October 13th, she found the door locked as usual. However, upon entering, she was struck by an unnatural silence. No voices or footsteps, not even the usual sounds of the house settling. She initially thought the family had overslept due to the cold weather, but her concern grew when she discovered the kitchen hadn't been used for their late-night snack, a ritual they always followed. The house, which should have been full of life, felt like a tomb. The Thornfield sisters had a nightly ritual. Around 10:00 they would gather in the kitchen for tea and light refreshments, discussing their day and preparing for the next. But on the morning of October 13th, the kitchen was untouched, neat and unused, just as Mrs. Caldwell had left it the night before. Concern mounting, Mrs. Caldwell ascended the staircase to check the bedrooms of Margaret, Catherine, and the twins. The hallway was unnervingly quiet, with no doors ajar, as was usual when the sisters were starting their morning routines. When Mrs. Caldwell knocked on Margaret's door and received no response, she hesitantly entered. The room appeared undisturbed, the bed made with meticulous care, as Margaret always did. Everything was perfectly arranged, pillows, symmetrical corners tucked, and her nightgown hanging neatly by the window. However, something felt wrong. The items on Margaret's dressing table, while organized, were not in their usual precise order. Some books had been removed and replaced incorrectly, and papers in her desk had been shuffled, indicating someone unfamiliar with her system had been through them. Catherine's room was equally unsettling. The bed again showed no signs of use, and her artistic materials were strangely neat. Catherine, known for her chaotic workspace, usually left half-finished paintings and scattered supplies. But that morning her room was spotless, as if someone had cleaned it with obsessive care. The twins' room held the most disturbing evidence. Nana and Elizabeth had always kept their room with perfect symmetry. But now it was clear someone had rifled through their belongings attempting to restore order, but failing to replicate their precise system. Drawers had been opened and closed, items shuffled around, but nothing was in the correct pattern. Mrs. Caldwell's horror reached its peak when she ascended to the third floor. Sarah Grace and Rebecca's rooms were eerily similar. 3 beds untouched, nightgowns hanging as if never worn, and clear signs that someone had searched the rooms, though not with the same intimate knowledge of each sister's habits. The unsettling scene across all the rooms hinted at a careful but unnatural disturbance, leaving Mrs. Caldwell with a sense of dread that would never leave her. Mrs. Caldwell's screams shattered the morning stillness, their intensity drawing neighbors from blocks away. Frantic, she ran through the streets of Selkirk, shouting that the girls were gone and something terrible had happened. Gabriel Thornfield, awakened by the commotion and voices gathering outside, initially refused to believe her. He rushed through the house, calling for his daughters, hoping for a simple explanation. But what he found was as horrifying as what Mrs. Caldwell had described: 7 bedrooms, untouched, no signs of the girls, but clear evidence that someone had thoroughly searched their rooms, rifling through every personal item, document, and possession. Sheriff William Harding arrived minutes later, his decade of experience in frontier law enforcement failing to prepare him for the complexity of the Thornfield case. He was used to dealing with cattle-rustling disputes and occasional violence, but 7 young women disappearing without a trace from a locked house was something entirely different. Harding's investigation only deepened the mystery. Every door and window remained securely locked from the inside, with no signs of tampering. No footprints were found in the soft earth around the house, despite the wet ground that would have left a trail. The more Harding searched, the more he found. Personal items in the sisters' rooms had been touched. Clothing unfolded, jewelry examined and returned to its box papers, shuffled and restacked, but nothing was missing. Valuable items remained untouched, money stayed in the drawers, and even the sentimental objects that only the sisters would recognize were left behind. The house, seemingly undisturbed except for the thorough search, held only questions, no answers. Sheriff Harding's investigation expanded across Selkirk as he interviewed residents who might have witnessed unusual events on the evening of October 12th or the morning of October 13th. What emerged was a troubling pattern of strange occurrences that had been developing throughout the summer and early autumn of 1899, creating an undercurrent of unease in the town. Several witnesses reported seeing well-dressed strangers arriving on evening trains, their expensive Eastern clothing and leather luggage marking them as outsiders. These visitors would hold brief meetings with prominent local figures before leaving on the morning train, avoiding the usual social interactions that typically occurred in small towns. Their behavior raised suspicion not only because of their wealth, but also due to their deliberate detachment from the community. The local telegraph office also noted a high volume of coded messages sent to addresses in Chicago, New York, and San Francisco, especially during the period leading up to the disappearance. Timothy Fletcher, the night clerk, confirmed that these messages sent late at night consisted of random strings of letters and numbers that meant nothing to him, but clearly conveyed important information to their intended recipients. Most of the messages came from Gabriel Thornfield, though other prominent citizens were involved as well. Further investigation into Gabriel's financial activities uncovered troubling irregularities. The town's bank president, Charles Whitman, was initially reluctant to discuss recent transactions, but eventually revealed that Gabriel had made large withdrawals of gold coins totaling a significant portion of his wealth. These withdrawals occurred immediately after the visits of the mysterious strangers, suggesting a direct link between their arrivals and Gabriel's financial dealings. What was more alarming was the pattern of Gabriel's wealth accumulation. His business, a general store, was unlikely to generate the kind of profits seen in his accounts, especially given the scale of his investments. Gabriel had received regular, substantial payments from Eastern sources with no apparent connection to his retail business. As the investigation progressed, federal agents and reporters from across the country became involved, drawn by the intrigue and tragedy of the 7 missing sisters. National newspapers from New York to San Francisco published speculative accounts of the disappearance, with artists' renditions of the sisters and theories about their fate. Inspector Marcus Reed from the Department of Justice was assigned to the case, bringing resources and expertise that local authorities lacked, further escalating the mystery surrounding the Thornfield family. Inspector Reed, a seasoned investigator with extensive experience in cross-border criminal organizations, was tasked with uncovering the truth behind the Thornfield disappearance. His involvement highlighted the growing concern of the federal government about organized crime in frontier communities. Reed's investigation into Gabriel Thornfield's financial dealings revealed troubling connections to a larger, sophisticated criminal network. Gabriel's rapid rise to wealth coincided with dubious transactions tied to mining claims, railroad contracts, and territorial government appointments. Most alarmingly, Reed discovered Gabriel's ties to the Rocky Mountain Development Company, a secretive investment group acquiring mineral rights across Montana and other Western territories using illicit methods. This organization operated through a maze of subsidiary companies, shell corporations, and proxy agents, making it nearly impossible for authorities to trace its true ownership or financial resources. Reed was able to confirm that the company had been systematically securing control of valuable resources by manipulating local officials and prominent citizens who were paid for their cooperation. Gabriel's role appeared to be a critical one. After his arrival in Selkirk, he received substantial investment capital that enabled him to expand his business beyond what would have been possible through normal commercial means. In exchange, he provided the company with detailed information about local mining operations, land ownership, and political developments that could influence business opportunities. As winter descended on Selkirk, the investigation into the 7 sisters' disappearance became a cold case. The town, once thriving, began to show signs of the trauma and suspicion that the mystery had created. Some families, uncomfortable with the federal investigation and the attention it brought, decided to leave. New residents unfamiliar with the tragedy moved in and showed little interest in uncovering the truth. Gabriel, now reclusive, rarely left his mansion except to visit the cemetery, where he had placed 7 marble headstones despite there being no bodies buried beneath them. His once bustling general store was sold its new owners, oblivious to the mysterious circumstances that had led to Gabriel's withdrawal. As they sifted through the store's records, they found that many had been destroyed or removed, making it impossible to understand the full extent of Gabriel's financial dealings. Over time, the physical remnants of the Thornfield sisters disappeared from Selkirk. Their belongings were packed away in the attic, and the cultural contributions they had made were overshadowed by the arrival of new activities organized by newcomers. Their names slowly faded from conversation as the town focused on moving forward, leaving the mystery behind, unanswered and unresolved. By the spring of 1901, Selkirk had been irrevocably changed. Many of the original residents had moved away, seeking opportunities elsewhere, taking with them their suspicions and theories about the fate of the Thornfield sisters. The town that emerged from this shift bore little resemblance to the tight-knit community that had once existed. Now it was populated by people indifferent to the Thornfield tragedy, more focused on personal advancement than uncovering the truth. This transformation mirrored broader shifts occurring across the American West, where the ideal of boundless opportunity gave way to the reality of exploitation, corruption, and the growing influence of Eastern financial interests. By 1922, 23 years after the disappearance, a discovery in Chicago would reopen the case and expose connections that stretched far beyond Montana. During the demolition of an old warehouse on the city's south side, construction workers uncovered a hidden room behind false walls. Inside, they found filing cabinets, storage boxes, and personal items documenting a criminal enterprise that had operated unchecked for decades. Among the artifacts were 7 photographs of the Thornfield sisters captured in informal poses that suggested professional studio work. These photographs were accompanied by detailed descriptions of each sister outlining their personality, skills, and physical characteristics, indicating commercial rather than personal interest. Most unsettling was the fact that the photographs appeared to have been taken after the sisters' disappearance. Margaret, seen in her 30s, had the mature, serious demeanor of an adult, while Catherine's image conveyed a sense of melancholy despite her elegant attire. The twins Eleanor and Elizabeth were photographed separately, revealing subtle differences between them. Sarah's photograph suggested continued involvement in charitable work, but her face bore the weight of lost dreams. Grace appeared in her mid-20s, her once bright eyes now dull from experiences that had crushed her spirit. Rebecca's image, showing her as a young woman in her early 20s, lacked the joy and vibrancy that had once defined her. Detective John Sullivan of the Chicago Police Department, investigating organized crime, immediately recognized the significance of these photographs and the accompanying documents. The materials were part of a vast archive detailing the operations of a sophisticated criminal network, which operated under the guise of offering domestic placement services and social advancement opportunities for families in frontier communities. This discovery would open a new chapter in the investigation into the Thornfield sisters' disappearance, revealing a dark underbelly of crime and exploitation that had remained hidden for decades. The organization's records, carefully maintained over decades, revealed a chilling and systematic operation that exploited vulnerable families across the American West. They targeted isolated, economically struggling families, offering what seemed like a chance at a better life for their daughters. Operating under the guise of legitimate businesses, employment agencies, matrimonial services, educational institutions, and charitable organizations, the criminals created the perfect cover for their real activities. Detective Sullivan's investigation uncovered that this network had been active since at least 1885, operating under various names and through front companies, with a focus on frontier communities where law enforcement was sparse and communication with outside authorities was difficult. The organization meticulously researched local conditions, identifying families vulnerable to financial strain or social pressures, and deployed sophisticated confidence schemes to convince them that they were offering genuine opportunities for prosperity and social advancement. The process typically began with well-dressed strangers arriving in these communities, presenting themselves as representatives from Eastern businesses or institutions looking to recruit young women. These recruiters came with impressive credentials, letters of recommendation from prominent figures, and proposals that seemed like real opportunities for struggling families. Parents desperate to secure a better future for their children were gradually drawn into a web of complex arrangements. Business investments, partnerships, or financial commitments that made it nearly impossible for them to withdraw once involved. The final stage involved the removal of the young women, often under elaborate deceptions. The women were told they were traveling to distant cities for jobs or education, while their families were misled into believing their daughters had left voluntarily to pursue more sophisticated lives elsewhere. Sullivan's investigation into the Thornfield case revealed that Gabriel's involvement with this organization had begun much earlier than anyone in Selkirk had realized. Correspondence found in the hidden archive dated back to 1893, a year after Gabriel's arrival in Montana, suggesting his rapid rise to wealth had been facilitated by the organization in exchange for his cooperation. Gabriel had served as a local agent, identifying suitable families and coordinating the organization's operations across Montana. Initially, Gabriel's role was minor. He provided information on local families and acted as a character reference for the organization's representatives when they arrived in Selkirk. However, as his relationship with the organization deepened, his role expanded. By 1899, as federal investigators began to look into the organization and local suspicions grew about the strange visitors and Gabriel's rapid success, his involvement became more significant. The organization, sensing that Gabriel had become a liability, demanded that he fulfill his ultimate obligation by offering his own daughters as compensation for their financial support. The letters revealed his growing desperation as he realized the true nature of what was being asked of him. What had begun as a way to secure his business success had now escalated into a horrific bargain that would cost him everything. Gabriel's letters were filled with a deep internal conflict. He was torn between his love for his daughters and the fear of what would happen to his family and community if he refused to comply with the organization's demands. The threats against him were subtle, but clear business failures, legal prosecution violence, and social ostracism that would obliterate everything he had built in Montana. Most heartbreaking were Gabriel's attempts to find a way out that wouldn't cost him his daughters. He explored multiple alternatives, offering more money, proposing to recruit other families' daughters, or even suggesting a move to a distant state where the organization couldn't reach them. Every proposal was rejected. The organization made it clear that only the surrender of his daughters would fulfill his obligations and ensure the safety of his family. The final entries in Gabriel's correspondence, written just days before the disappearance, revealed a man who had come to terms with the inevitable. He hoped against hope that his daughters would somehow survive and forgive him for his failure to protect them. He had been assured that they would be well cared for, married off to wealthy men who would offer them comforts and opportunities they could never have in Montana. Gabriel had been promised that his daughters would be given comfortable lives, but at a terrible cost to his soul. As this shocking revelation came to light, the horror of the conspiracy deepened. The organization's systematic exploitation and corruption spread far beyond Montana, revealing a network that had operated with near impunity for decades, ruining families while enriching a criminal elite. The disclosure of Gabriel's letters and the organization's methods set off a nationwide investigation into similar disappearances across the West. Detective Sullivan's discovery was just the tip of the iceberg. Federal investigators uncovered evidence of corruption that reached into the highest echelons of government. Judges had been bribed or coerced to ignore missing persons cases and dismiss legal challenges. Sheriffs and territorial marshals had been paid to suppress investigations and intimidate families who tried to pursue justice for their lost daughters. Even more appalling was the revelation that several prominent politicians and business leaders had been complicit in the trafficking operation. These individuals used their positions to facilitate the movement of young women while publicly presenting themselves as defenders of law and order as well as champions of family values. These supposed pillars of society had profited immensely from the destruction of frontier families, all while hiding behind a veneer of respectability. The full scope of the conspiracy unfolded as investigators traced the financial records of the organization, uncovering the staggering extent of its reach. Over 300 young women from frontier communities across Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and California had been trafficked through this network between 1885 and 1910. These women, ranging in age from 14 to 26, were selected based on their physical beauty, intelligence skills, and family situations that made them prime targets for exploitation in the illegal marriage market. This dark chapter in American history, once thought buried, was now being revealed piece by piece. and the consequences for those responsible would be felt for generations. The operations of the criminal organization had been enabled by the technological and social transformations that defined the late 19th century American West. The expansion of railroad networks allowed for the swift and efficient transportation of victims across vast distances, while the isolation of frontier communities and the limitations of communication systems made it nearly impossible for families to track their missing daughters or coordinate with law enforcement in distant jurisdictions. The organization expertly exploited these conditions, using the remoteness of the frontier to conceal their activities and evade detection. At the same time, the organization preyed upon the deep social and economic vulnerabilities endemic to frontier life. Families struggling with poverty, isolation, and the limited opportunities available to their children were particularly susceptible to offers that seemed to promise a better life through legitimate arrangements. The criminal network's representatives were adept at identifying these vulnerabilities, tailoring their proposals to address each family's unique concerns and gradually drawing them into manipulative arrangements. These families, in many cases, would never have agreed to such arrangements had they known the true nature of what was being offered. In Selkirk, the revelations caused a rift in the community. Some demanded justice for the Thornfield sisters and accountability for the officials who had aided in their disappearance, while others feared the social and economic fallout from exposing the full extent of local involvement in the conspiracy. Many residents had directly or indirectly benefited from Gabriel Thornfield's prosperity, particularly from investments made by the Rocky Mountain Development Company in local businesses and infrastructure. The town's mayor banker and several prominent merchants were implicated in the cover-up, having received payments to suppress inquiries and prevent investigations that could have uncovered the truth years earlier. Although some local officials had suspected Gabriel's wealth came from dubious sources, they chose silence in exchange for the economic boost his success brought to Selkirk. The most shocking discovery came when investigators examined the local cemetery's records. Gabriel's 7 marble headstones erected in his daughter's honor did not mark their deaths as assumed, but the dates when they were forced into arranged marriages in distant cities. Gabriel had been informed of each daughter's fate and marked each with a memorial. But these dates served as a grim record of his daughter's forced enslavement. The realization that Gabriel had known the true fate of his daughters, yet chose to maintain the fiction of their disappearance to avoid exposing the organization, shifted his status from a tragic victim to a willing participant in their destruction. After his death in Denver, a suicide note was found, revealing that his guilt and despair had driven him to madness. The note also suggested that Gabriel had possessed crucial information that could have led to his daughter's rescue had he had the courage to reveal it to the authorities. As the federal investigation expanded, it became clear that the organization responsible for the Thornfield tragedy had not been dismantled in 1910, as previously believed. Instead, it had evolved, adapting to changing social and economic conditions, continuing its operations under new guises and leaving behind a legacy of destruction that had yet to be fully eradicated. By 1922, the criminal organization that had once operated in the shadows of the American West had transformed into what appeared to be a collection of legitimate businesses, employment agencies, matrimonial services, and social organizations. However, beneath this facade, they continued to operate using the same predatory methods that had first destroyed the Thornfield family, adapting to urban environments and evolving social norms. The organization shifted its focus from isolated frontier communities to more urbanized areas, preying on recent immigrants, displaced rural families, and urban residents struggling with poverty and social dislocation in rapidly expanding cities. In the spring of 1922, federal investigators armed with evidence uncovered in the Chicago warehouse and Gabriel's correspondence launched a coordinated series of raids across 12 states. The operation, involving over 200 federal agents and local law enforcement, targeted the now modernized network while also searching for any surviving victims of the original trafficking operation. What they uncovered exceeded even the darkest expectations of the investigators. The raids led to the liberation of dozens of women still held in involuntary servitude, but more importantly, they revealed detailed records documenting the fates of hundreds of missing persons, including comprehensive information about the Thornfield sisters. The investigation pieced together the tragic stories of their lives following their forced removal from Selkirk. Margaret Thornfield, investigators learned, had been taken to Cleveland and forced into marriage with Harrison Pembroke, a wealthy steel mill owner who had specifically sought a wife with teaching experience and intellectual capabilities. Margaret was told the marriage would provide social status, financial security, and the opportunity to pursue her educational interests in a sophisticated urban environment. However, the reality was much harsher. Pembroke treated her as an ornamental possession, expecting her to enhance his social standing and bear children who would inherit her intellectual qualities. Margaret bore 3 children, but was forbidden from contacting her family or revealing her true identity. She was even told to lie to her children, claiming she was an orphan with no living relatives. Margaret's attempts to escape were thwarted by Pembroke's connections to the trafficking network, which closely monitored all the women they placed, living under the name Mary Patterson. Margaret endured nearly 23 years of captivity. Despite this, she maintained her intelligence and strength of character, secretly documenting her experiences in journals. These hidden writings provided investigators with crucial information about the organization's operations and the locations where other victims might be found. Catherine's fate was equally tragic, though different in its pattern of exploitation. She had been taken to Milwaukee and married to Augustus Richardson, an art collector, who sought a wife with artistic talents to exploit for both personal enjoyment and commercial gain. Richardson forced Catherine to produce paintings under his name, isolating her from artistic communities and using her work for his own profit. The emotional toll on Catherine was evident in the paintings she created, works of remarkable technical skill, but infused with a profound sadness and desperation. Now living as Carolyn Phillips, Catherine survived by channeling her anguish into art, secretly planning her escape but never able to act due to constant surveillance. The twins, Eleanor and Elizabeth, were intentionally separated in an effort to sever their close emotional bond and make them more malleable. Eleanor was placed in St. Louis with Marcus Whitfield, a businessman who wanted a wife capable of managing his household with frontier efficiency. The separation from her twin sister caused Eleanor severe psychological trauma, resulting in a complete mental breakdown within months. Elizabeth was taken to Chicago and forced into marriage with Samuel Henderson, a banker who valued her practical frontier skills but cared little for her emotional well-being. The trauma of the separation and her captivity transformed Elizabeth from the confident, outgoing young woman she had been into a withdrawn and fearful person. Both twins were told that their sister had died, an intentional lie designed to prevent them from seeking each other out and to eliminate any hope of a reunion. This cruel tactic was standard procedure for victims who had particularly strong family bonds, making them more resistant to their captors' demands. Sarah's story was one of the most heartbreaking. She was transported to Detroit and forced into marriage with Reverend Jonathan Morrison, a prominent minister who sought a wife with musical talent and a religious background. Morrison exploited Sarah's abilities by forcing her to perform in his church and at social events, all while presenting himself as a devoted husband and religious leader. The investigation into the Thornfield sisters revealed not only the individual horrors they had endured, but also the dark, widespread operations of a criminal network that had been systematically exploiting vulnerable women for decades. The network's success was built on deception, coercion, and manipulation, exploiting families' hopes for a better future. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the scope of this operation extended far beyond what anyone had imagined, with its roots stretching deep into American society, touching even the highest levels of government and business. The investigation into the Thornfield sisters' tragic fates uncovered more horrors as the years of abuse they endured came to light. Sarah Thornfield, who had died in 1905, had been officially recorded as dying from pneumonia. However, evidence suggested that her death was the result of years of physical and emotional abuse that had weakened her health, making her more susceptible to illness. During her final illness, Reverend Jonathan Morrison, her captor, refused to provide her with adequate medical care, seemingly viewing her death as an opportunity to request a new wife from the trafficking organization. Grace Thornfield's story was equally devastating. Her exceptional mathematical abilities made her invaluable to the organization's leaders. She was placed with Theodore Blackstone, a wealthy Chicago businessman who forced her to use her talents to manage his complex financial operations. Grace was kept isolated from the outside world and coerced into helping him facilitate criminal activities, including money laundering and fraudulent investment schemes that destroyed the lives of many innocent victims. Despite being forced to contribute to Blackstone's wealth, Grace secretly tried to sabotage his operations by introducing subtle errors into his financial records, hoping to expose his crimes. However, her acts of resistance were discovered, and she faced severe punishment that eventually shattered her spirit and health. She died in childbirth in 1909 alone, and far from her family, denied the medical care she desperately needed. Rebecca's fate was perhaps the most heartbreaking. Her youth had initially made her unsuitable for immediate placement, and she spent years in various holding facilities as the organization waited for her to reach an age when she would be considered marketable. The constant relocations and the trauma of being separated from her family took a severe toll on Rebecca's physical and mental health. By the time she was old enough for placement, her condition had deteriorated to the point that she was no longer seen as a viable asset for the organization. Rebecca died of tuberculosis in 1907, having spent her last years in a facility that was little more than a prison for unwanted victims who no longer had any commercial value. The revelations about the Thornfield sisters became a central focus of the 1922 trials, which gained national attention and exposed not only the horrors of their disappearance, but also the widespread exploitation of vulnerable families across the American frontier. The public was horrified by the details that emerged during the trial, leading to widespread calls for reforms in law enforcement, interstate commerce regulations, and women's rights protections. Marcus Peaton, the criminal mastermind behind the trafficking network, was arrested at his Chicago mansion in a dramatic raid that uncovered a wealth of additional evidence of his crimes. The raid revealed the full extent of Peaton's wealth and political influence, which had enabled his criminal empire to operate with impunity for decades. During his trial, Peaton demonstrated no remorse for the lives he had destroyed. His extraordinary intelligence and organizational skills had been twisted into the creation of a criminal operation that had ruined hundreds of lives, and he showed no regret for his actions. The trial became a turning point in the fight against organized exploitation, shining a spotlight on the dark underworld that had operated for so long under the radar of law enforcement. During his trial, Marcus Peaton expressed no remorse for the atrocities his organization had perpetrated. Instead, he boasted of his operations, framing them as a successful business that provided valuable services to clients who appreciated the superior qualities of frontier-raised women. His cold, calculating demeanor and complete lack of empathy for the victims horrified even the most seasoned court observers. His testimony further solidified the image of a sociopath, capable of committing systematic crimes without conscience, exploiting vulnerable families for decades. 17 of Peaton's associates were convicted on charges related to kidnapping, human trafficking, conspiracy, and corruption of public officials. The evidence presented during the trials revealed the sophistication of the organization's operations, as well as the deep levels of corruption that had allowed these crimes to go undetected for so long. However, the web of corruption and complicity surrounding the trafficking operation meant that many key figures escaped prosecution. Evidence was destroyed, witnesses were intimidated, and several crucial individuals mysteriously died before they could testify. Prominent politicians, judges, and business leaders involved in the conspiracy managed to avoid criminal charges due to their political connections and financial power, although their reputations were forever tarnished by the exposure of their involvement. The three surviving Thornfield sisters faced an agonizing choice when they were given the opportunity to testify publicly and seek justice for their suffering. Testifying would require revealing their true identities, which could shatter the lives they had painstakingly built during their years of captivity. It would expose them to retaliation from surviving members of the criminal organization and possibly endanger their children. Margaret, now 49, and living under the name Mary Patterson, chose to testify despite the personal cost. Her courage in confronting her captors and recounting the details of her 23 years of enslavement made her a powerful advocate for other trafficking victims. Her testimony helped set legal precedents that would later offer better protections for women and families in vulnerable situations. Margaret's intelligence, dignity, and ability to articulate the psychological and emotional toll of her experience resonated deeply with both the jury and the public. Catherine and Elizabeth, however, chose to maintain their assumed identities and live quietly with the knowledge of their past. Catherine, now living as Carolyn Phillips in Milwaukee, had built a life that included children who knew nothing of her true background. She felt that exposing the truth would destroy their happiness and security without offering meaningful benefit to other victims. Elizabeth, still living as Ellen Pierce in St. Louis, had never fully recovered from the psychological trauma of being separated from her twin sister. She felt emotionally incapable of reliving her experiences through public testimony. The decision of Catherine and Elizabeth to remain silent was respected by investigators who understood that these women had already sacrificed enough. They had no obligation to expose themselves to further trauma in the pursuit of justice that might prove elusive. Their choice to preserve the lives they had built reflected the complex reality. Many trafficking victims face the need to balance the pursuit of justice with the practical need for survival and protection of their families. Selkirk itself never fully recovered from the exposure of the Thornfield family's tragic story and the corruption that enabled it. Many longtime residents chose to leave, unable to continue living in a community built on such a horrific foundation of exploitation and betrayal. The Thornfield mansion, which had stood empty since Gabriel's departure for Denver, was eventually torn down in 1925, and the lot was left vacant as if the town sought to erase any physical reminder of the family's fate. The 7 marble headstones in the cemetery were replaced with a single monument bearing the inscription, "To the 7 sisters, victims of greed and betrayal. May truth finally set you free." This new memorial was funded by contributions from residents across Montana who had been moved by the sisters' story and wanted to ensure their sacrifice would not be forgotten. The Thornfield case had a far-reaching impact, contributing to significant reforms in the handling of missing persons cases across the United States. New federal laws were passed to ensure greater oversight of employment agencies and matrimonial services. An improved interstate cooperation in criminal investigations was achieved through the establishment of new communication systems and standardized procedures for sharing information between law enforcement agencies. The case helped establish a precedent for tackling human trafficking and protecting vulnerable families, ensuring that the Thornfield sisters' suffering would lead to changes that would help prevent future tragedies. The Thornfield case revealed a deeply troubling truth: how economic desperation and social isolation could render entire communities vulnerable to exploitation by sophisticated criminal organizations. The lack of adequate law enforcement and communication networks in frontier territories created the perfect environment for predators like Piton's organization to operate with impunity, exploiting countless families while amassing wealth through systematic human trafficking. The investigation underscored the particular vulnerability of young women in these frontier communities. With limited economic opportunities and social restrictions, many women were entirely dependent on their families' decisions about their futures. The trafficking network took advantage of this dependence, presenting itself as a provider of opportunities for the young women, offering a chance for a better life. In reality, it trapped them in conditions of slavery that were often worse than the limitations they supposedly escaped. The legacy of the Thornfield case would continue to shape American law enforcement and social policy for decades. The investigation provided crucial insights into the methods used by trafficking organizations, helping develop more effective strategies to prevent similar crimes. This case also sparked broader awareness about the need to protect vulnerable populations from exploitation and to address the social and economic conditions that allowed such exploitation to flourish. It serves as a stark reminder of how desperation can obscure the truth and how the pursuit of prosperity can lead to the destruction of everything we claim to value most. Gabriel Thornfield's ambition to give his daughters better lives made him susceptible to the deception that ultimately destroyed everything he held dear. The sisters, valued only for their youth, beauty, and innocence, were victims of a system that treated them as commodities to be bought and sold, rather than as human beings deserving of protection. The Thornfield sisters paid the ultimate price for their father's ambition and for a society that was willing to turn a blind eye when profit was involved. But their story is also one of resilience. Margaret's courage in testifying against her captors, despite the personal cost, ensured that other victims would receive better protection and that those responsible for these crimes would face justice. The mystery of the Thornfield sisters of Selkirk ultimately became a reflection of the price of the American dream and the vulnerability of those who pursued it without the safeguards needed to protect them from predators lurking in the shadows of frontier society. Their tragedy reminds us that progress and prosperity mean nothing if they are built on the suffering of the innocent. True civilization is not just about material advancement, but also about the moral courage to protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit them. But is everything really revealed? The evidence suggests that the trafficking network was even larger than investigators were able to prove, and that similar crimes may have been committed in other frontier communities across the West undetected and unreported. What do you think? Do you believe there are still secrets buried in the files of this century-old conspiracy? Share your theories about what truly happened in Selkirk, and whether other families may have suffered similar fates. If you enjoyed this tale of historical mystery and want to explore more of America's dark past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves mysteries as much as you do. See you in the next video, where we'll uncover another chilling chapter from our nation's hidden history.